we're running. So I'm assuming you can see and you can hear, and if that's not true, somebody holler or wave, or we'll figure it out. So thanks very much for inviting me today, and it's really great to be joining you. I have been teaching here at MCLA since 2005. My background is in aquatic ecology and water quality. And we are, a small program and really interdisciplinary. I also teach an environmental policy class. And so when Chelsea reached out, who's an alum from our program, I was really happy to come and kind of combine that sort of background and some of what we talk about in that course to develop this presentation, and just really honored to be invited by Beat, and especially by Chelsea. So thanks very much. So what I thought I would talk about today is a little bit about the Clean Water Act, which turns 50 this year. And so I'll give a bit of information about some of its main ways that it works, as well as some of its shortcomings, and then how it directly relates to what we understand about water quality in Berkshire County, particularly focusing on the Hoosick and Housatonic River watersheds, which make up the bulk of Berkshire County. We'll talk a little bit about what I'm calling old news pollutants. So those are basically pollutants that are regulated. That doesn't mean that our waters are free of them, but just that we know which ones tend to have problems with those pollutants. Emerging pollutants, primarily those that are not yet regulated. And then what we may see looking forward, a couple of thoughts to keep in mind. So I think we'll get into it. And as I understand the format here, I'll go for about half an hour, and then we'll have a nice opportunity for questions and answers afterwards. So please think about questions that you might like to bring up. All right, so I'm going to go over a little bit about some of the history here of the Clean Water Act that can be helpful to keep in mind. So the Clean Water Act wasn't actually the first federal statute dealing with water pollution, but it was a real revamp of the statutes that had been in place beforehand. Primarily, the legislation that existed before was somewhat weak, tended to fund research and some technical assistance to the states. But there was this period in time that we've heard about where there was this developing consciousness around environmental issues and protection in this country. So what you may see on the lower right there, picture many of you may have seen before, that's actually the Cuyahoga River on fire. And that was in 1969. It had actually burned multiple times before that, but nobody was really paying attention. And so as people started to become more concerned about environmental issues, they took notice of this river burning and thought maybe that shouldn't be happening and we should do something about it. There's the first Earth Day celebration in 1970, and there was really broad consensus for passing the Clean Air Act first in 1970, and then the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And so also an interesting little tidbit, actually, Nixon initially vetoed the Clean Water Act due to its price tag, but Congress had enough votes to override that veto. So some interesting characteristics with how this is set up. The Clean Water Act of 1972 really increased the influence, the power of the federal government, but very much in partnership with the states. So, for example, the federal government sets these federal effluent standards for specific industries. For example, mineral mining and processing, there are standards that those industries have to follow in their water discharges. And we'll get to that process. Dairy product processing, pulp and paper, paperboard, all sorts of other specific industries have specific industry-specific standards. But the states are actually responsible for developing their own state water quality standards. And they have to be approved by the EPA. And if the EPA doesn't approve them, they can kind of maintain control over water quality permitting in the state, which is actually the situation in Massachusetts. So, all right, so we have this federal-state partnership, and a big part of how the Clean Water Act works is through this NPDES permitting system, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NPDES. And so what this says is that any industry that is discharging pollution to a river needs to have a permit to do so. And so this is if they're emitting, if they're discharging water to a jurisdictional jurisdictional waters, and we'll get to jurisdictional waters in a minute. So let's see. So states develop these water quality standards. If they're approved by the EPA, then the states can then also administer the NPDES permit program. But some, and for some states, the EPA does it directly. Let's see. So there's some other bits of the Clean Water Act, but we'll focus on these, which are kind of the bulk of what makes this statute what it is and effective to a certain degree. All right, so I said we'd mention jurisdictional waters because this is a continuing political debate. And so I said, you know, an institution that is releasing water to jurisdictional waters needs an NPDES permit. So what water is covered by the Clean Water Act? Well, it was really written to apply to so-called navigable water. And so there's been this question that has, under different administrations, been interpreted in different ways, also as a result of some Supreme Court cases. And so not only NPDES permits, NPDES permits, but also these so-called dredge and fill permits. So Section 404 of the Clean Water Act says that if you're going to do any work in jurisdictional waters, you need a permit as well. And so several Supreme Court cases and then several presidential rulings later, we, under Trump, basically had the situation where the so-called Waters of the United States rule was dialed back so that fewer waters were considered jurisdictional waters. And the Trump administration is now kind of working on strengthening those jurisdictional waters, that Waters of the United States rule, to apply to things like wetlands that are connected, say, through groundwater to navigable waters, not just the navigable waters or wetlands that are connected via some sort of surface waters. So enough talk about jurisdictional waters, but it's definitely something that we'll keep hearing about and that has a lot of implication in how the reach of the Clean Water Act. Something else to mention, and this will come back, is this question about non-point source pollution. And actually, so what does that mean? So that covers all sorts of pollution that gets into rivers that gets there not through pipes that have these NPDES permits, but runoff from agricultural lands, runoff from urban areas, from parking lots and roofs. It brings in nutrients and pathogens, sediments, a variety of pollutants that are detrimental to rivers, and they're not covered by the Clean Water Act. So they're actually currently more polluting than point sources of water pollution. And there's some, there is some federal funding that can be used to try to work on non-point source pollution, but it's not regulated in the same way. And then finally, something else that we'll come back to are TMDLs, total maximum daily load. And so this is another section of the Clean Water Act of 1972, section 303D. It was written in there and then it was ignored for several decades. And then in 1992, the EPA finally published some regulations establishing procedures for developing these TMDLs. And what they are is that if there's some waters that are deemed to not meet water quality criteria, if there's greater pollution in there than what's allowed by the water quality standards, then there's supposed to be a TMDL that's developed that looks at what all the sources of pollution are, and then determines what kinds of reductions are necessary to bring that water in line with the water quality standards. And so the Hoosick River and Housatonic rivers in Massachusetts are actually all part of a Northeast Regional Mercury TMDL. So I'll talk about that in a minute. For the Housatonic River in Connecticut, there's a TMDL for pathogens. And I've seen a reference for TMDLs being developed for the Hoosick and the Housatonic rivers for pathogens in Massachusetts. Apparently there's going to be public comment in this year sometime. I haven't seen any update beyond that. I'm sure BEAT will be on top of it though. So I expect to hear when that opportunity arises. All right, so we'll get back to a few of those, but we'll move on from the Clean Water Act and take a look at these two watersheds. So probably everybody on this call has heard of a watershed, but this idea that, you know, right now I'm in North Adams, and so water that falls here will make its way into the Hoosick River. So that means that here I am in the Hoosick River watershed, the area that drains to the Hoosick River. And what we see on the left here, let's see, Jane, do you see my arrow? Okay, great, thank you. So, so here's the Hoosick River watershed in the northwest corner of Massachusetts, the northern part of Berkshire County. And that is actually part of the larger Hudson River watershed. So then on the right here, for those of you further south, let's see, we can see we've got the Housatonic River watershed draining the central and southern parts of Berkshire County, and then meeting the Atlantic Ocean at Long Island Sound. What else to say about that? So that covers most of Berkshire County. There are also bits of the Farmington River watershed, the Westfield River watershed, and the Deerfield River watershed in the county. But we're just going to focus on the Hoosick and the Housatonic because we only have a bit of time today. So let's take a look at what we can find out about water quality in these two watersheds. And if you want to go digging further, I recommend that you take a look at this document. It has the most recent information about water quality in Massachusetts. So the Mass DEP used to put out a report about every 7 years, or they were supposed to, 5 years or so, on each watershed in the state. That process often was delayed just due to staffing challenges. Then they kind of went to this approach of kind of doing this statistical probabilistic sampling, kind of homing in on areas of concern. And then they've now recently switched back to doing a 7-year cycle. So we should be seeing water quality assessment reports on the different watersheds. But this is a whole integrated list of waters here for the state. And it divides up all these different segments of the rivers and streams in Massachusetts, and also provides information on lakes and ponds. And it divides up these waters into various categories, and I won't go through all of them, but I will mention the one that's maybe most interesting is the Category 5 waters. And so those are also called the 303D list. So waters that require a TMDL. So there's some pollutant that it is exceeding the water quality standards, and there's supposed to be a TMDL written up. All right, so we can take a look then at what we find if we look for the Hoosick River watershed, so the 303D list here. And so what I've done here is kind of condensed a whole bunch of information. And so some river segments in the Hoosick River that come up on this list come up for these various reasons. So E. coli and fecal coliform, I'll talk more about that in a minute also, but basically pathogens. PCBs, probably everybody's aware of PCBs in rivers in Berkshire County. I won't talk too much about it. There's some indication of some chronic aquatic toxicity with some of the tests that were done. Nutrients and eutrophication, I'll talk a little bit about that. Temperature, and then as a result of the flood control work in North Adams, there's altered streamside vegetation and cover and flow regime modification. That actually is listed as an impairment, these last couple here, but they don't, since they're not a pollutant, they don't actually require a TMDL, these flood control issues. Cheshire Reservoir in the Hoosick River watershed, we see it shows impairment for algae, likely related to the nutrient and eutrophication issues, as well as the presence of non-native invasive aquatic plants, which is very common in our lakes and ponds. In the Housatonic River watershed, you're going to see a lot of the same challenges. Again, we see pathogens, PCBs, zebra mussels, that's a new one that wasn't on the other list, so an invasive species there. Again, chronic aquatic toxicity, nutrient issues, temperature. There's several other streams that were included if you dig further into that document. And you can also see some similar challenges for the lakes in the Housatonic River watershed, mercury, PCBs, again, the non-native invasive aquatic plants and zebra mussels. All right, this is not, again, an exhaustive list, but you're welcome to dig further into it if you like. All right, so I said I would divide up these pollutants into these ongoing challenges, the regulated pollutants, and some of the emerging concerns. So I mentioned E. coli and fecal coliform. So these are actually indicator bacteria. They tend to be associated with more pathogenic giardia and other kinds of organisms that are cause illness in people. And so I've done, and I know Beat also has done a fair amount of work trying to track down sources of pathogens to our rivers, often due to aging infrastructure, leaking sewage pipes, illicit connections, people that are hooked up to the stormwater system, their sewage rather than the sewer pipe. Sometimes agricultural practices can contribute to pathogens entering the river. And so, yes, so I mentioned we should be seeing a TMDL developed for both the Hoosick and the Housatonic River to address pathogens. Phosphorus is one of these main concerns relating to non-point source pollution. Agricultural runoff, urban and suburban runoff from fields and farms, animal waste, wastewater treatment plants have really been trying to reduce their nutrient discharge. And so phosphorus and nitrogen also can lead to eutrophication, this process where it stimulates the growth of algae, which as that algae then ultimately decomposes, can draw down levels of oxygen available. For example, in lakes in the late summer or in the late winter, you can end up seeing fish kills if there's large amounts of nutrients flowing into them. And then it also leads to coastal eutrophication in dead zones, which have certainly received a lot of attention. Let's see. Mercury, I mentioned that Massachusetts is part of this larger regional mercury TMDL, and there's actually been quite a bit of work done on reducing local sources of mercury pollution. Largely, mercury is emitted when coal is burned, but also waste incineration, medical waste incineration, and from dental waste. Mercury amalgam. So this mercury, when it ends up in an aquatic environment, if you have kind of the right conditions with not a lot of oxygen and the right bacteria, the mercury can become methylated and it turns into a form that can then biomagnify up the food chain. And so that can be a human health risk. And that's why there's been quite a bit of attention focused on this. And in the region, there has certainly been a lot of effort to reduce mercury pollution in the Northeast, which has resulted in a measurable decline in mercury in fish tissue. But there's still work that needs to be done. All right, so all of these are regulated under the Massachusetts water quality standards. PCBs, certainly we know about the cleanup, likely both in North Adams at what was the Sprague site where PCBs had contaminated the area. And then of course, GE in Pittsfield, some of the work that's been accomplished there and the ongoing planning for the downstream sections of the Housatonic. Temperature also is actually considered a pollutant if temperature rises too much in the Hoosick or the Housatonic River. That makes it inhospitable for some of the fish that live there. So parts of the Hoosick River are actually considered a cold water fishery. So trout, brook trout really need cool water that is able to hold high amounts of oxygen. And so that's something to keep in mind. And then I mentioned invasive species, especially in our lakes and ponds. They're not covered by TMDLs, but there's a variety of efforts that are going towards trying to maintain them. Generally, a common approach is using various kinds of herbicide treatments. There's also drawdowns and hand harvesting. So people are trying a lot of different things. Okay, and so I think I'm getting close to the Q&A, and that's good because I have breezed through a lot of information. So I hope that you have lots of questions going. I'm just going to have this last couple slides, and then we'll see what wasn't clear and what other ideas people have. So a couple emerging concerns I wanted to point out was even though, so salinization, chloride is regulated in the Massachusetts water quality standards, but because of road salt and water softeners, there's actually been just this very widespread salinization of fresh waters, which is threatening the aquatic systems and also threatening water supplies because at some point water can become so saline that it's not healthy, especially for people like with hypertension. So this is something that is receiving more attention, and there are there's some efforts to try to use best management practices with respect to road salting practices in the winter. There's some regions that are developing chloride TMDLs, so it's an area to keep an eye on. And then these so-called CECs, contaminants of emerging concern. So I picked out a couple that have been in the news recently, but I know there's many more of these. And so, you know, we've heard more and more about how plastics are sort of ubiquitous in the environment now. many of us, I think I'm not guilty at the moment, but I was yesterday of wearing my fleece, my polar fleece. And so as you wash them, the microfibers come off, and they are actually ubiquitous in coastal and fresh waters. They go to wastewater treatment plants, which either let them go out into the receiving waters in the ocean, or they capture them. And then what happens to the sludge? Well, many times that sludge is spread back on farms, so it gets back into the environment. So they're just kind of everywhere. And they absorb chemical pollutants, which they can also then be consumed from marine organisms, and again, magnified up the food chain. So they're a big concern. These PFAS also have gotten a lot of attention, both kind of locally, Hoosick Falls and nearby Vermont towns. They, again, also kind of ubiquitous. They don't break down. They're used to make things like Teflon and all sorts of products. They're in pretty much everyone's blood, but they are also a suspected human carcinogen. And so there's actually just an announcement about the Biden administration trying to take some action on PFAS, which is great. All right, so looking ahead, there are a few things to look forward to and have some trepidation about. So Biden's infrastructure package, this is the one that was actually passed. So there should be $11.7 billion for wastewater systems and treatment to be distributed somehow across the country. The details of that are forthcoming, but they're coming. So that potentially in our regions, where we're struggling, for example, still with pathogens, nutrients, that could potentially address challenges with aging pipes, with wastewater treatment systems and upgrading those to reduce nutrient discharges. So we'll see, fingers crossed on that one. Climate change. So that, of course, we look to with more trepidation. With warmer temperatures, those lead to, as I was talking about, nutrient pollution, eutrophication that tends to increase the likelihood of eutrophication, algae blooms, and particularly harmful algae blooms, which are becoming a problem globally. It also, we know we have these larger rainfall events that can lead to more runoff in some areas with combined sewer overflows, more problems with those. So challenges for sure. And then finally, just, we started off talking about the Clean Water Act, and really it's focused on point source pollution. And yet we know that non-point source pollution is now a bigger issue than point sources. And it's still not very stringently regulated. It's not regulated by the Clean Water Act. So it is a continuing challenge, looking at potentially developing more TMDLs that may incorporate stormwater and other sources of these particularly nutrient pollutants, options to incorporate more green infrastructure in the future to try to capture them at the source. Lots of possibilities that maybe we can go into depending where we want to go. But I won't talk anymore because I've talked long enough and fast enough and about way too many things probably. So I'll pause and let anyone, however you do the Q&A session. I'm not sure, Chelsea or Jane, if you moderate or if I, yeah, how do we do this?
Yeah, I can moderate. So gallery view. Does anybody have any questions? Also, thank you so much, Elena. That was fantastic. Yeah, I'm sorry if you felt rushed. I really enjoyed it. Very
good. I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, so someone might have just asked, oh, Zoom meeting, Hoffman Bird Club presented from a car in Costa Rica.
How do we ask questions?
You can, sorry, you can unmute or you can send it into the chat. It's up to you, whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay, well, I have a question. Thank you. That was very informative. I'm sorry I had to start a little late. I came in a little late, so I missed the first 15 minutes, and I'm bummed out about that.
Didn't miss too much.
Is that I don't know. I don't know. You don't get to say that. That was you know what you're talking about. So the question I had, well, first of all, can we get the deck that you used?
I would be very happy to share that. So let's see, maybe Chelsea, I'll send it to you afterwards and then you can make it available. Does that sound good?
That'd be great. I'd appreciate that because I was taking notes, but I missed some things and that'll remind me. How do we tap into the $11.7 billion from the federal government in the infrastructure bill at a local level to help start to, because yeah, how do we tap in?
Yeah, I want to know that too. I don't think the Biden administration has said yet how it's going to happen. Okay. And so I'm hoping that there will be information coming. And then I'm hoping that locally we can see some action on getting some of those funds for really much needed repairs and improvements.
So the government agencies that will be, and how much will come to Massachusetts and all that stuff is okay. All right. Because we have this big cleanup that's going to be happening. So there's already a lot of activity going on, and with all the professionals running around, you know, and you might be able to double your money a little bit in terms of infrastructure. It's going to happen, right?
So they passed the infrastructure bill. So what's the statute now? Yes, it's passed. And it's going to happen. I do believe it's going to happen, but yeah, maybe a month from now we can check in and see what exactly that process is. Actually, that would be another, you know, we expect Beat to help get all this information out. Beat will probably tell us how we can get some of these funds to much needed uses.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, no problem.
Right, so Brian Harrison asked, can you give examples of federal and state guidelines for developed standards for water pollution?
Yeah, sure. So, as we said, the states actually have to create their water quality standards. So, for example, Massachusetts is going to have a standard for, let's say, pathogens, and so. A standard that's near and dear to my heart. So, for example, I think for E. coli, this indicator bacteria, they actually divide the waters into different categories too. So it's like recreational waters would have one requirement. Drinking water would be something else. Beaches. So I think Class B waters, where you should be able to swim, has an E. coli limit of something like 235 colonies per 100 milliliters, and as sort of a one-time sample. So the state will do some testing on their own. I think Beat actually has done this work and has sort of like, a QAP. So basically Beat can also do a bunch of this sampling. And then I think because they have gone through the process of getting approved to do so, the state will also rely on that data in reporting out in their next integrated list of waters. So, if you're collecting samples and you see, your samples are over 235 colonies per 100 milliliters of E. coli, then that would indicate that maybe not meeting that criteria. So you can actually look, and that's another thing I think I can send a link to if someone wants to know. We can find a link to the Massachusetts water quality standards, and you can look up your parameter of interest and see what the different criteria are. Hope that helps.
Awesome. Thanks, Elena. And thank you, Brian.
Sure.
So Neil is wondering, I'm following the legislative initiatives regarding PFAS in Maine. What's going on in Mass? Is municipal sludge still allowed to be spread on farm fields?
That's a great question. I've only, I've seen a little bit of reporting about some of the PFAS and farms that have recently been documented as having high levels of PFAS in Maine. Really, horrible situation. I don't know what may be done specifically in Massachusetts. I haven't heard about specific PFAS policy in Massachusetts, and if anybody else has, I would invite you to share. What all I heard about PFAS, I think there was an announcement within the last week or so that the Biden administration wanted to address it in a couple of ways. I think they wanted it to be included in basically the Superfund statute. So if PFAS were found, that could be considered evidence for listing as a national priority site. Oh, look at that. Beat to the rescue. So there must be some specific information from Massachusetts. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to follow that up later, Jane, or feel free if you had some.
Oh, it's the mass.gov website, and it has a whole bunch of sub-sites in it. PFAS and firefighting foam, residuals in Massachusetts rivers. So a bunch to check out.
I think the Biden administration also is proposing regulating PFAS under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which would be very beneficial. So, there's the right to know. So, you get this report from your water supplier every year about if your water supply doesn't meet certain criteria. So not only disclosure, but also requirements to test and maintain drinking water within parameters that will hopefully this will develop into an actionable item. DEP is conducting a free private well assessment for PFOAs in rural towns. Oh, in Massachusetts. Awesome.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I'm sure I do. I just don't, they're not coming, they're not. My concern is with the PCBs in the Housatonic River and the Hoosick River. That's the big one. And for me, I don't know. I think it's kind of it's the big problem. And I was wondering, you alluded to PCBs, and you said that we know a lot about that. And I was wondering, was there more that you knew about that you could share with us? Because I don't really know.
Oh yeah, sure. So let's see, I guess in a nutshell, so I'm more familiar, I guess what I meant to say was that I think Beat and the folks in Pittsfield know a lot more about the history of the Housatonic. In my my quick speech, I didn't come out quite right. So I know a little bit about the Hoosick and the cleanup and sort of the ongoing studies. So there's a lab at Williams that has sort of had a steady trickle of students that have been looking at PCB pollution in the Hoosick River. And it has shown sort of a slow but steady decline in concentrations in fish tissues. So I think that was somewhat expected and sort of somewhat good news. It's not all cleaned out. It's still there, but I think that actually the most recent report suggests that even though the PCB levels are still very much measurable, I think they are actually within allowable parameters in the Hoosick River. But again, these were sort of from
Is that the result of cleanup efforts or just the natural
Yeah, I think both. So they were actually removed from a site on the Hoosick River by Sprague, now Massmoka. So that certainly helped. And then, I mean, right, the PCBs, they sort of stick to those bottom sediments. And so they stay for a long time, but they're slowly flushed out. So I think you're right. I think it's both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one quick question then, just, I'm sorry, if nobody else has had any questions. I don't want to monopolize the forum here, but you said that there's regular testing going on within the Hoosick. Thank you for that link. I'll take a look at it. Are there also regular testing? Is there regular testing that you're aware of going on in the Housatonic is it published, or is it where do we find it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, so the studies I know that are going on at Williams are sort of in a couple of the faculty members there have an interest, and so they have some students, and every once in a while there's sort of a presentation or a newspaper article. I do not remember off the top of my head when the most recent data on PCBs, included in the Massachusetts DEP integrated list of waters. I'm not sure when it was last tested. In terms of the Housatonic River, I think there's a lot of testing going on. It's a good question about, by whom and if it's published. I think, there's a lot of monitoring going on in the areas that have been remediated. And I'm assuming that it continues to be done on the downstream section too. But yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Jane knows.
Yeah, right now, GE and EPA are going to be doing a lot of testing from Fred Garner Park on down. And if you go, I dropped a link to the EPA website, which has all the millions of documents about this, but you can go look at the most recent ones show where the next set of testing is going to be. And you can also find previous testing on there. And for just general river monitoring, I think DEP has a website that has published a lot of the surface water monitoring, and BEAT has been testing the actual stormwater outfalls, which has been really interesting. And at the moment, that isn't out and published, but we're compiling lots of
That's interesting. So Jane, so that the link here, and I'll shut up, I promise. The link here goes to that's the mother lode of documents on the EPA.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if you have trouble navigating it, give me a call tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of used to those kind of morasses, so I'll probably be okay. But if I need help, I'll call you.
Perfect. And I think Tom Tining,
I saw Tom Tining's hand. Hello, also.
Just maybe. Thank you, Elena. That was great as usual. Listen, a couple of quick things, and I may have missed it because I was sipping my tea. What about lead?
So that's interesting. Let's see. What about lead? I would think that there would be a lead standard in water. I have not seen any segments listed as impaired as a result of lead.
My general information is about lead in wetlands, particularly from gunshots, but especially from lead weights from fishing. And I'm surprised that stuff is still allowed in many states, including ours. But I didn't know hardly anything else about it, and I didn't know if is that not federally regulated?
But let's see. Lead sinkers. So they're definitely phasing out lead sinkers. I think yeah, I'm not sure if they're officially banned or just frowned upon. And it's a great question, right, about wetlands. And so it definitely makes me wonder if they have, ammunition, if they are testing, right, because it's a whole long list of pollutants that are regulated, but there's only a report that comes out every 7 years, and it's not an exhaustive, list of what they're actually able to test for. So I would be fascinated if you do know of any studies that have looked at lead. I would love to follow up on that.
Yeah, most of it's in waterfowl tissue, it's
Tissue.
but that's it. I've got something really very weird and very quick, I hope. Can you put a slide back on? Is that too much problem?
Sure, I can put that back on.
The maps of the two watersheds. I'm trying to find a student at school here, or maybe you have a better shot at it at MCLA, with some GIS background. Yeah, wouldn't it be so much better if we had our state and county boundaries that matched watersheds? Wouldn't that make a lot of environmental sense if we could redraw these artificial straight lines and that goofy little thing in Tallinn, Mass, to put everybody in the same bucket? Because I think Jane, of all people, told us about when GE had maybe it was a tongue-in-cheek suggestion, just blow up Woods Pond Dam and flush all those PCBs to this magic place called Away. Connecticut said, no, it's really not a good idea because we're the away part. So, but what if we were all in the same watershed? Wouldn't that be somehow so much nicer? So anyway, I think there's a GIS program, some student project could be to put together a new political boundaries based on sub-watersheds and watersheds that would be, I think, have some potential value. Not to mention confusing to people, but still put us all in the same, literally, water bucket.
It's a fascinating idea. It's one that we were just talking about trying to plan around watersheds rather than political boundaries in my policy class that I was mentioning earlier this semester. And before I kind of ended up doing this work, my understanding was that there was actually a watershed program through the state, through Massachusetts. I think it was the DEP. It was one of the Massachusetts state agencies that had a watershed focused approach to planning. But I don't know why. I'm assuming funding, why it disappeared shortly before I started in this line of work.
Yeah, cool. Well, this was great. Thank you so much, Elena.
My pleasure. And I wanted to say, despite the chaotic start, that I did finally get to open up my screen here and see a bunch of familiar names and faces. And so it's really nice to see everybody. All sorts of great information.
Yeah. So we're getting close to 7, but does anyone else have any questions, any comments?
Just thanks again. I really appreciate the learning.
I have one other question. One of the things I don't see any way to get around is, what about drugs that we all take that end up getting flushed down the toilet and aren't taken up by our wastewater treatment plants? I'm thinking things like birth control pills, adding estrogens to our water. How are we going to deal with that kind of emerging pollutant?
Yeah, so that if I put my slide back up again, and under the contaminants of emerging concern and many others, so that would be caffeine and all these estrogenic compounds and BPA and all so what's kind of a concern to me is that we still call caffeine, we still call them emerging, but they've been emerging for a couple decades now. So I similarly so some of those, especially, particular kinds of drugs can be deposited in the police station. There's been some research focused on them, and I think I'm not aware that there's wastewater treatment options that are really proven at this point to be able to address them. Even if we are able to get some of this, $11.7 billion, I don't think that we have that technology that's ready to go. So maybe again, it's really focusing some funds on research and development. Is there, some way that we can better be treating the water to get them out? I don't have the answer, but I think it's a good one also to think about for the future. These I would say concerns that have emerged, these contaminants that have emerged as, being concerning. What should we do with them?
Well, thank you
I
so
have
much.
a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It seems like probably a lot of people in Western Mass, in the Berkshire area in particular, rely on site septic systems more so than are connected to wastewater treatment facilities. I'm just curious, is there like an incentive program or anything for people to stay on top of maintaining and updating their on-site septic systems?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think if I know anything about that. I don't know, other than like maybe ultimately if it came down to it, if somebody reported. Title V. Okay, Title V, I guess. Jane,
Isn't Title V just when you sell? I don't think we have any good way of catching it unless it either becomes really obvious or you sell. But I don't really know.
Okay, thank you. That's okay.
Another great question.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much, Elena. I really appreciate you being here. It was great. And I'm sorry for the issues we had at the beginning.
No, I'm sorry. It wasn't yours. Oh, thank you very much for having me. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.